Okay, folks, as you're coming in, there's a number of people who are here from the Detroit Institute of Arts who can help you find your way around throughout the day. So could I ask that everybody from the DIA just raise your hand so that, so there's people around you from the DIA. If you have any questions, these are all very friendly people who can help you find your way around. And I think we're getting close. There's a few people still coming in, so I think I'll get started. First of all, thank you all very much for coming to Detroit today for this symposium, which has been in the works for years. And it's a team of people has been working really hard on this, much harder than I have, to make this day come together. And we're thrilled with the turnout. Really glad that you've made the effort to be here today. My name is Jennifer Tchaikovsky. Up until August 30th, I had the great pleasure of being the Vice President for Learning and Audience Engagement here at the DIA. And so most of the work, almost all the work that I did and my involvement in this was through the DIA. This past week, I started my new job as the executive. I have to even think of this. I am the Deputy Director for Engagement at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. So, thank you. Thank you. And as I told a few people, it's been quite a week. I moved to another country, and I've been living in an Airbnb. My moving van comes Tuesday. This is happening today. I drove into Toronto to stay with my sister. I left my entire suitcase in Toronto. So it's been that kind of a week. So. Made a quick trip to TJ Maxx last night, and here I am. Okay, thank you. I knew you all would understand. Okay, so here we are for this wonderful day, and I want to thank, first of all, you very much for being here, because one of the things that we're working on is finalizing the study guide for the research project, and we need your help and your input for that. And so your participation in the questions this morning, the Q&A sessions, and in the breakout sessions this afternoon is going to be really helpful that way. So please do participate so that we can finalize that user's guide and get it published. So, without further ado, I'm going to do some additional thank yous here, because this has been a project that's been going on for some time. And this is a very complicated slide that shows all the people who've been involved with this. First of all, from the IMLS, which was the funder for this project, there was a huge national leadership grant from the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and also some significant funding from the Samuel H. Kress Foundation and the help of Max Marmer, the president of the Kress Foundation. Also, as you know, this is a joint project between the National Art Education Association, and Deborah Reeve is the executive director there, and her entire NAEA team has been extremely helpful throughout this process. Also, it's a joint project between the NAEA and the AAMD, and so Christine Agnagnos, executive director, and her entire team, including core team member Andy Finch, who's been working alongside the team through the whole way as the director of policy from AAMD, have all been instrumental in making this happen. So let's give them a round of applause. Then we've also had the great pleasure of working with one of the best in the business, as far as I'm concerned, RK&A, Randy Korn, the founding director and intentional practice leader, Stephanie Downey, the director of RK&A, and Amanda Krantz, the managing director. Wonderful colleagues to work with, and they have really made sure that this is a incredibly high quality research project, and it's been great to work with them throughout. Then I'd like to introduce the members of the core team, and if you guys, I should actually, RK&A folks, you want to stand up real quickly? Is Randy here? Yep, there's Randy. Thank you. And then the core team, Barbara Bassett, the Constance Williams Curator of Education, School and Teacher Programs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Julene Chevalier, from the Head of Interpretation and Participatory Experiences at MIA. There is she. Yep. Also the incoming director of the NAEA Museum Education Division. Michelle Grohe, Interim Curator of Education at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. And current NAEA Director of the Museum Education Division. Melissa Higgins Linder, Director of Learning and Engagement at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And did a great job as the project manager for this program from 2015 to 17 before she took her current position. And then, of course, Emily Holtrup, Director of Learning and Interpretation at the Cincinnati Art Museum. She's been project director for this entire effort. And she's also was the NAEA Director of the Museum Education Division from 2015 to 2017 and really saw this project through in very important ways. So thank you, Emily. And then my colleague, my former colleague, Megan Panisi here at the DIA. Megan is a researcher in the Department of Interpretation here at the DIA, and she has took over as the project manager after Missy left for her new job, and she has just done a fantastic job coordinating all the details. You all know how all the details that go into planning something like this, and so Megan, thank you very much. And then finally, Wendy Wolf, Deputy Director of Learning and Community Engagement at the Vizcaya Museum and Gardens. And then we had a task force that was involved in the project as well, and I'm just going to read off their names. Kimberly Sheridan, Mary Ellen Munley, Ann Craybill, Lynn Pearson Russell, Ben Garcia, Robert Sable, Jackie Terraza, Marissa Rise. Did I say Ann Craybill already? Yes. Stacy Shelnut Hendrick, Emily Jennings, and Ann Henderson. If you guys could all stand so we can acknowledge you. And our very special advisors, Angela Fisher, George Hine, Jennifer Novak Leonard, Danielle Rice, and Sri Srinivasan. If you're here, can you rise? We can acknowledge you. Yay, thank you. Thank you. And finally, our critical readers, Olga Hubbard, Dana Carlisle Klechka, Brian Kissida, and my former colleague here at the DIA, Matt Sikora. So if you guys could stand. Thank you all very much. So as you can see, it takes a village to do something like this. And so all of you, thank you very much for your efforts along the way. So just really quickly, you should all have an agenda for the day, but basically we're going to start off with what you came for, to hear the presentation of the study findings, and we'll have a Q&A for that. You have? Oh, yes, sorry. Thank you. Oh, sorry, forgot. This is very important here. We went to some schools and did some research. Thank you, Megan. And these are the museums and the schools. These are the museums that we worked at with a number of schools who came on field trips at these museums. And they've been wonderful partners with us, hosting RK&A and the research team so that we could conduct this research over time. So thank you to all these museums and the representatives. If you're here, can you stand and we can give you a round of applause as well? Thank you all very much. Thanks, Megan. Okay. So now, yes, so quickly through the day, we're going to present the study findings with a Q&A during that time. We're going to have Barbara introduce the study user guide. Then we're going to have a break around 10:30. At 10:50, we will reconvene for the directors and have a conversation about the study from their perspective, which Emily will moderate. And then we're going to have a lunch break. There'll be Q&A during the director's session as well. Then we're going to have 2 breakout sessions in the afternoon with a break in between, allowing you some free time in the galleries if you'd like. If you have not been to the DIA, I highly recommend you see Rivera Court. That is a must-see spot. And then we'll have closing remarks and a reception between 4 and 6 back in the space we were in for the breakfast, and that'll be a cash bar some of you may want to take advantage of after this long day. But again, really grateful that you're all here, and I'm now going to turn this over to Emily.
Good morning, everyone. Is this not like the fanciest podium you've ever seen? I feel very steampunk at the moment. It's awesome. Thanks so much for being here today, and good morning. And I want to send another big special thank you to Megan and Jennifer and the DIA folks for hosting us today. Like Jennifer said, she moved to another country, she started a new job, she did lots of things in this last week, and I don't know how she did it. So I just want to big congratulations and applause for her. So I'm so happy that this is the slide, because this is from my home museum, so it's making me feel very much at home right now. I know that we're really eager to get to the findings, and I'm eager for you to get to the findings as well. But we really feel it's important that we set the stage for how long it took us to get here and the process. So I was thinking about, think of me as the veggies you have to eat till you get to your dessert, but I promise that they're really good veggies. And hopefully you'll see just the vast quantity of people who've worked on it. I'm lucky enough to stand in front of you and tell you about it, but like I said, there's been a ton of people who've worked on this project, and I thank them so much for getting us to the finish line, which we will be at 6 o'clock tonight. I'll be at the cash bar. So the big question that started off all of this is, what are the benefits of art museums to people? I mean, that's a huge question, right? And it's one of the most vital questions that art museums and art educators face. How are we important? What do we give to folks? And depending on the lens with which you examine this question, answers may be that art museums drive economic development, contribute to cultural understanding, serve as community hubs, or support K-12 academic test scores. And while this is all important, none of these data points address the true value of art museums to individuals and communities. To better understand and demonstrate the difference art museums make in people's lives, the field must advance research that holds up to intense analysis. Without research-based data, art museums may find it difficult to convince policymakers and civic leaders that they are vital to communities. As cultural institutions, the art museums are more than nice, that we're necessary. I think we can all agree with that. Teacher feedback and the direct experiences of museum educators indicate that good and productive things happen for students who engage in exciting conversations and explorations of artworks during art museum field trips. I know that we've all seen those wonderful aha moments. And research related to inquiry-based teaching, engagement with original works of art, and aspects of learning in museum environments further support that art museums can be places where rich learning and discovery happen. Yet, as I said, substantive research on facilitated single-visit museum programs is currently limited. To answer the call for formal research on art museum impact, the Museum Education Division of the National Art Education Association, NAEA, that's how we'll be referring to us from now on, because that's a mouthful, and the Association of Art Museum Directors, or AAMD, forged a formal partnership in 2013. The result was this intensive 4-year nationwide impact of art museum programs on students' research study. And as we've already mentioned, the funding came from the Samuel H. Kress Foundation and a 3-year national leadership grant from the Institute for Museum and Library Services supported research conducted by Art K&A. We say that it was 4+, but I was looking at the calendar, it's more 8+. The NAEA and AAMD core team identified facilitated single-visit school art museum programs as the focus of this study because they are the most prevalent student experiences at art museums. According to a national survey of US art museums carried out as part of this study, 96% of museum respondents offer these types of programs. Along with family programs, they often provide young people their first entry points to these learning environments and the objects they hold. This presentation and the recording, which I'm excited about, will be part of the impact of art museum programs on student research study websites. So there's going to be a wonderful website where you can get all of this information. And it supports the study's findings on how facilitated inquiry-based single-visit art museum programs might impact participants across 5 capacities, which Stephanie will talk more about, which are creative thinking, critical thinking, sensorial and affective response, human connections, and academic connections. We also mentioned that they were conducted at 6 geographically and collection diverse museums in 7 school districts across the United States. And this research provides valuable evidence-based insight and language for talking concretely about the benefits of students' engagement with original works of art during a facilitated single-visit program. Our hope is that the study's results advance scholarship in both museum and art education and serve as a powerful leveraging tool to support student learning in art museums. So, why? That's a great question. Student need, or study need. And as I said, this need for this study really did emerge from simultaneous discussions that were happening within NAEA and AAMD between 2010 and 2011. So we have a lot of folks that were here at the beginning, and I want to say a special thank you to all of you that are here and have joined us today who got this kick-started in 2010. Like I said, 8 years. Both identified a lack of rigorous research to respond to questions about the effects of facilitated single-visit art museum programs on students. While there are several studies that explore the effects of multi-visit art museum programs, there's a lack of information about facilitated single-visit programs. This was considered problematic as facilitated single-visit art museum programs are the most common ways in which art museums serve school students. Only the studies of facilitated single-visit programs at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art have begun to fill this research need. However, the studies at Crystal Bridges focus on the teaching of one specific museum with a specific collection and student population. By contrast, our study sought to understand programs that represent museums nationwide so that the findings of the study would be generalizable to the field at large. So, for the study, we created a research question and hypothesis. Our research question was, what are the benefits of art museum programs for students in grades 4 to 6? Specifically, what are the benefits of facilitated single-visit art museum programs that are guided by inquiry-based pedagogies? And then our hypothesis was, though short in duration, facilitated single-visit art museum programs affect students in complex, multidimensional ways. There is not one direct effect. Rather, there are potentially multiple interrelated effects that are central to the education of young people. So we're going to go get in our time machine and go back to 2010 to 2013 and talk a little bit about our timeline. Because I think it is important to see how much work really goes into a project like this, and how long ago we actually started. So 2010, 2011, as I said, conversations with NAEA and AAMD identified the need for the rigorous research to respond to questions about the benefits of art museum. From 2011 to 2012, NAEA developed a research agenda with the help of RKNA to answer this question: what are the benefits of art museums to people? And in 2013, NAEA determined that facilitated single-visit art museum programs were to be the focus of the first study from the research agenda. So there are more to come, hopefully, and convened a task force to define the scope and research of the study and developed a request for proposals to plan for the study. 2014, 2015, we moved into our planning year, and we received planning support from the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, which we very much appreciated, and contracted the research team of RKNA. Jackie Terrassa, the then Museum Education Division Director, also completed a 6-week Kress Museum Education Fellowship at the Clark Institute, where substantial time was dedicated to launching the project and creating a preliminary framework for an annotated literature review, which we have extra copies of, which will be available later at the reception. So this is a reason for you all to stay for the reception. I brought them all up in 3 very heavy boxes from Cincinnati, so please take them because I don't want to take them back to Cincinnati. So in the autumn of that year, a core team comprised of representatives from the NAEA and AAMD worked closely with RK&A to develop a strategic framework for the research initiative focused on articulating the value of art museums to the K-12 community. Also, a working group comprised of 11 art museum educators, as we said, many of who are here today, representing NAEA's geographic regions and a range of art museum types, sizes, and communities, convened to begin identifying some of the key components which influenced our research design, including program elements and possible student capacities to investigate. And we'd like to thank again the Crest Foundation for hosting us on that day. In the winter, we, NAEA, AAMD, and RK&A submitted a proposal to IMLS for a national leadership grant to support the study on the impact of facilitated single-visit art museum programs. And then we all crossed our fingers and toes for about 6 months, waiting to find out if we got it. And additionally, RK&A conducted a state of the field survey to explore prevalent practices of facilitated single-visit art museum programs and conducted stakeholder interviews. An advisory group representing various stakeholder audiences was also developed or is formed pending funding of the study. So we were pre-working. The core team in the spring confirmed the capacities of the focus of the study, established a set of criteria for site selection, and then began reviewing potential museum sites, seeking facilitated single-visit art museum programs across a diverse range of museums, geographic locations, and communities. So, in 2015, IMLS granted funding for the study, and we all took a deep breath. I may have had to put my head between my knees and take a really deep breath at this, we got to work, and it was exciting. And the core team representing NAEA, AAMD, and RK&A was formed to officially oversee the study, and our project manager was hired. Thank goodness for Missy. RK&A in the winter developed instruments for the study that were reviewed by the advisor group and received approval from the Independent Institutional Review Board, the IRB. And let me tell you, when Amanda called and said, you're going to have to do this online thing to get certified to do research on human subjects, I was like, really? Okay, that's new for me. It just seemed interesting, and something I'd never done. And also the Walters Art Museum signed on as a museum partner to pilot the instruments and protocols, so thank you to them. In the spring, members of the core team completed an extensive literature review to develop a full understanding of the value of the study. RK&A tested the research instruments with the Walters Art Museum, and the team also announced the 6 museum partners. Summer of that year, RK&A reviewed results of the pilot study with the core team and advisory group, and RK&A and NAEA also submitted research applications to all involved school districts. 2016 and 2017, or as I like to refer it, when the weekly Friday phone calls started, check-in phone calls with Stephanie and Amanda and Missy and I to talk about how things were going, was the year for data collection. In the autumn of that year, we finalized our research approvals with the school districts and invited schools to participate in the study. And this seems like such a short bullet, but this is such a huge task. And if we would not have had RK&A's team and Missy managing all of this, I probably would have a lot more white hair right now. And it's just amazing the amount of work that went into this and so many logistics. Imagine that, and all the museums for their work on making this happen. In the winter of that year, RK&A delivered and collected parent and guardian permission forms for student participation in the study and collected pre-program questionnaires. In the spring, RK&A conducted museum and classroom observations and collected post-program data, including student interviews, teacher questionnaires, and museum educator interviews. Again, it seems like such a short bullet for so much work. And now we're here, happily. So year 3, data analysis and dissemination. From summer 2017 to summer 2018, RK&A processed data and prepared reports. Critical readers, including the advisory group, provided feedback on different versions of the report documents. Lots of reading. I think I could read this and see it in my sleep at this point, which is exciting. And now we're here, which is very exciting. Autumn 2018, that the impact of art museum programs on students' research study results and user guide are published, or almost published. And we are here to celebrate with this culminating symposium at the DIA. So this has been our little walk through time, and it's now my great pleasure to pass the podium to Stephanie Downey, who is the director of Arcane.
That made me tired. And I had a few flashbacks. Thank you, Emily. So next we're going to turn our attention to the research design, starting with site selection. So this is how we made choices to choose the 6 museums in the study. Largely, this was informed by the survey that Emily mentioned, the State of the Field survey. 270 museums responded to that, and they became our pool from which to select the 6 museums. That survey also helped us establish criteria for that selection, and I'm going to run through some of the criteria now. So because we decided to focus on grades 4 to 6, we could only work with museums that served that age group, and many of the museums did serve that age group. But the other factor was that they had to have the capacity to serve enough students for us to reach our sample size. So that was one criteria. We also chose to work with museums that serve Title I schools. The reason for that is that in the survey we found that the majority of museums do target Title I schools, and we wanted this study to reflect that standard practice. We chose 1 museum per geographic region to make sure that we had national representation. We aimed for a mixture of urban, suburban, and rural areas. Although we were unable to secure a museum in a rural area, we did have suburban and urban. And we aimed to include a variety of museums, so contemporary art, university museums, private museums, encyclopedic museums, again, to try to get national broad representation. We also had to consider the school districts that the museums were located in. As Emily mentioned, we had to go through IRB and school district applications, and some school districts require you apply a year in advance, and that's not reasonable, so we had to eliminate museums in those cities. And then we eliminated any museums that were in a transition period, such as new leadership. Another important factor was that the programs in the museums needed to be inquiry-based. So we came up with a criteria for deciding if something is inquiry-based. The survey asked there were a series of statements on the survey, and respondents rated them from 1 to 7, with 7 being describes our program. So these first 3 bullets are the kinds of things we would expect to see in an inquiry-based program. So any museums that rated these 3 statements 5 or higher were considered. 2 other important factors for inquiry are time and space to allow inquiry to happen. So the facilitator to student ratio needed to be low because it's a group discussion to allow as many children as possible to participate. And then we decided that that time factor was important, that you really can't experience inquiry in 5 minutes. It takes more than that. So we only considered museums that made 4 to 5 stops or fewer in the program, which most of them were about an hour. And these are the 6 museums. So the Hammer Museum represents the West Coast. The Museum of Fine Arts Houston is the Mountain Plains region. The Columbus Museum of Art is in the Midwest. The Orlando Museum of Art is the Southeast. RISD is New England, and the Walters Art Museum in the Mid-Atlantic. So now I'm going to turn back to the research question and hypothesis. Just review it with you. Emily showed it to you. And I want to point out a couple of things in the research question. One is I have in bold that we were looking very specifically at single visit programs in a museum with original works of art. I know museums do all kinds of programming, but we were singling in on the programs that happen in the museum. And we also, as I mentioned, were singling in on inquiry-based programs. So not all single visit programs are inquiry-based, but we made the choice to focus on that. So in response to that question, we developed the research hypothesis, which is that there are multiple interrelated benefits to students when they go on a single visit program. We had to identify what those benefits are, and this took quite a bit of time, and it was informed by that team that Emily told you about when we met in the fall of 2014. It was a group of seasoned museum educators drawing from their professional experience, thinking about what they believed is possible in a single visit program. It was also informed by the literature review that we did, drawing from the research that's available. And these are the 5 areas we chose to focus on: critical thinking, creative thinking, sensorial and affective responses, human connections, and academic connections. And I want to point out a few things about this. So as you can see, they're overlapping. It's very important to us that recognize the overlap among these different areas, that they don't happen in isolation. But for the purposes of doing a study like this, we have to operationalize them and define them and sort of take them apart. But we recognize the overlap. The reason academic connections is underneath the other 4 is because we believe it encompasses all of these things. And one other thing is that we call these capacities, not skills or competencies. And the reason for that is that in a 60 to 90-minute program, it's really not possible for a student to master a skill or to become competent in anything, but they can have their capacities enhanced. So now I'm going to go through and break apart each of the 5 capacities and tell you how we defined them. So critical thinking is, in the last decade, it's become highly emphasized area in museums, not just art museums, but science and history museums also consider critical thinking to be a key outcome for single visit programs. And part of this might be because schools have really emphasized critical thinking. There are different ways of conceptualizing critical thinking, but we use the definition by Daniel Willingham, and I'll try to paraphrase. His definition is that critical thinking is deducing and inferring conclusions from available facts and supporting those conclusions with evidence, also being open to other conclusions and evidence that may be different than your own. So you can see that our 2 measures very much represent that definition. So next is creative thinking. We see a lot of overlap between critical thinking and creative thinking, and people often say them together, critical and creative thinking. They are similar, but they are also different. And the main way they're different is that critical thinking emphasizes logic and analysis, and creative thinking emphasizes the unknown and the imagination. And so these are the 3 measures we identified for the study. There's less consensus on what creative thinking looks like when you look at the research compared to critical thinking. All kinds of things come up: problem solving, flexible thinking, metaphorical thinking, questioning and wondering. There's a very long list. So we identified these 3 for the study. And then sensorial and affective response is the most elusive of the 5 capacities because of its subtle qualities. And describing to you what it means is actually kind of hard to do in words, but it's the way that we experience things with our senses. So with art, it's not just our eyes. We experience it with all of our senses. It's the way we feel in our bodies a response to a work of art. And this can happen also when you're, on the top of a mountain. It's your body reacting without your brain really it happens almost unconsciously. And it's also that emotional response that goes along with that. So as you can tell, it's very hard to measure, and we were limited in what we could do in this study, so we decided to focus on emotion, and we decided to defined that by how students remembered their experience and the way they talked about it. And we call that emotive recall. We also wanted to look at captivation. Captivation is, when you're sort of swept away or caught up in a moment of experiencing something. And we defined it for students, that students think art is amazing. Human connections actually is very connected to the sensorial and affective response. And human connections is also one of those outcomes that's common across lots of different museums, because there's this belief that with museums' collections and objects and artifacts, that there's a lot of opportunity for making these kinds of connections. So we identified these 3 measures as human connections. And the connection between this capacity and sensorial and affective response comes together in this idea of empathy, and in particular bodily and emotional empathy. And it's kind of like what I described before. It's the way when you're looking at something and your body has a reaction and you feel something, and not only do you have that response, but then the next jump might be to feeling a connection to something. So it's very hard to define, but I think you probably all know what I'm talking about, and it happens. Lastly is academic connections. There's 2 ways to think about this. One is transfer. So that's the transfer of skills from one setting to another setting. So in this case, students might practice critical thinking skills in the museum and then take that back to the classroom and be able to apply it and do better, or vice versa. So that's transfer. The other way to think about it is content. So that the content that students learn on a tour relates to and supports the curriculum content. We were limited again in what we could look at with this one. Transfer wasn't realistic to measure. So we defined this one by students' perceptions, whether they felt there was a connection between their experience in the museum and their experiences in school. Now I'm going to turn it over to Amanda. We're almost to the findings. So this is Amanda Krantz, Managing Director of RK&A.
And I'm going to pre-apologize if I have to step away. I've been sick the last week, so I will try not to cough into the mic on anybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about our research design to start. It was a quasi-experimental research design. What that means is it was set up somewhat like an experiment. We had 3 different study groups that you can see in the green top part of the chart. So we had a treatment A group, which received the program intervention of a single visit museum program that's facilitated by a trained docent or museum educator, in which students view original works of art. To kind of break this down more into layman's terms, the important part of this is it's happening in a museum setting by a museum representative leading the program. The difference between that and the next group, which is treatment B, that group is a group of students who received a program that was happening in their classroom. So we're trying to take away the variable of the museum and the original works of art. So the idea was they were having the same type of program as the students who came as part of treatment A, except for it was in their classroom. It was also still led by a museum educator or docent from the museum. And they were looking at reproductions of works of art and talking about those. And then we had a control group, which is a group who did not have any type of program, art museum program intervention during the study period. They were offered a program after our study was completed. I'm going to talk about the methods that are in the columns, the pre-measure, program measure, and post-measure in a minute, but what I just wanted to point out was that all of those things kind of are the same across, so that we could do this comparison between these 3 groups. Why it's not experimental, the one difference, what makes it quasi, is that we didn't use random assignment. So we weren't randomly assigning these classrooms to study group. We went through the process of assigning them ourselves. We were looking at a lot of different variables in terms of ELL percents, percent free and reduced lunch, to try and make a designation that was approximately even across the groups, but it was not random. And we used a regression analysis to then look at those variables that may have an effect, something that you don't, with random assignment, that you have less concern about. We're pretty proud of our sample size. It was a lot of work to get this sample, as you can probably tell by our very stressed out presentation earlier, and thanks to Missy for getting all these students on board. We observed 101 museum and classroom programs. We have 4,134 questionnaires from students that were completed. Some of those had passive consent, some had active consent, meaning we had to have parent permission to do this questionnaire. So we're pretty happy with those numbers, and 627 student interviews. This red line kind of just designates, I'm going to be talking mostly about the items at the top. There are other components to our study I'm not going to be presenting findings on. There's smaller in sample size, but they are available to you if you haven't looked at the technical report yet that's available online. All that data is in there for you to enjoy. I do want to talk a little bit more in depth about the three methods I'm going to pull data from specifically. So the first one was the program observations. These were observations of the museum and the classroom programs that were part of the study. They were very much focused on the facilitator, so how the program facilitator was leading the program. So we were looking at what they were doing, the things that they were saying, time that they were allowing for looking during the program. We had a team of data collectors that we had trained across the country who conducted these. During the actual program themselves, they took open-ended naturalistic notes, so writing down what was happening and what they were hearing. And then what they did later, and you'll see part of this in the afternoon session, they had a form that they completed for us. And it asked them to rate a bunch of teaching behaviors that we had identified on a scale from 1 to 7 from weak to strong, and then provide us evidence to back those up from pulling from their observation notes. And that's the data that we used. We did mostly statistical analysis on it, although we had those open-ended notes to reference as well. You can see on the right, and again, you'll see more of this afternoon, but in part of our training, we went through and spent a day with the data collectors and then follow up, identifying what behaviors we see in support of the behaviors that we were looking for them to look at. So for example, in this chart that I know you can't really see very well, but facilitator helps students question and investigate. And then those bullets on the right are specific examples of what that might look like in a program. What would a facilitator do? What would they say to help support students in that capacity? Student questionnaires, it looks like probably what you expect. It's a questionnaire. It's that thing on the right. It's mostly rating statements that we had, and each statement was written to align with a capacity. As Stephanie had referenced, the capacities, we consider them overlapping. There's some interconnection, but to try and measure them, we tried to write a statement per each capacity to look at different things. Students completed the questionnaire as a pre and a post, so if before program intervention and afterwards. And so that was so we could look at where they were at baseline, where they were at the end. We used linear regression for this, and again, we plugged in some different variables that we thought may affect the results on this and whether we could attribute it to the treatment. So things like we were looking at how long in between pre and post students took it, because there was a good variation. We were working with a lot of schools across the country. Things like ELL percents and all that were plugged into our regression model. And then lastly, I'm going to be talking a lot about the student interviews. So what these are, we had over 600 students that we sat down one-on-one and interviewed. The interviews mostly took the form of a performance-based assessment. What that means is we were looking for students to demonstrate their achievement in capacity areas. I probably don't want to use the word achievement, but I can't think of a better one right now. But basically, students were looking at this work by Marc Chagall. We had printouts of it in front of them while the students sat one-on-one. We asked them some initial kind of warm-up questions about what comes to mind when they think about art, but most of the questions that we we ask them as part of the interview, we're asking them about the work of art and what they see and what kind of meaning they make from it. Our questions were open-ended, and they really mimicked a lot of what happens in the programs that we were looking at. So in an inquiry-based program, they followed a lot of that model. We audio recorded all the interviews as well as transcribed them to facilitate our analysis. And we did use both the audio recording and the written transcript as we went through analysis. We scored these on a rubric, and that was so that we could run statistical analysis and comparison. So we developed rubrics for a whole, I think there were about 10 of them at one point, 10 different rubrics to measure the interviews on. So they're a 4-point rubric, and you'll see some of those in a minute. And so we scored on those, and again, we were using linear regression to analyze the data. Okay, to jump into some of the findings. So starting with the program observations, that's where I'm going to pull this data from. This is a list of all the teaching practices that our data collectors were looking for when they were observing programs. This graph is actually based on the mean ratings, but I pulled the numbers away just so you can focus on how things shake out relative to each other, but those are available in the technical report if you're interested. Two things I just want to point out before I talk more in depth about this. One, again, this is about the facilitator of program observations. So we weren't looking for the student achievements and so how well the student was actually observing and looking closely. It was about how much the facilitator is supporting the students in these behaviors based on all the examples that we had given to data collectors. The second thing I want to point out is museums who participated in this did not see any of this. And we did not expect them to teach necessarily to any of this. So this is kind of a shakeout of, we think these 5 capacities and these teaching behaviors are things that are happening across the country. This is kind of how it shakes out when we look at those programs that we studied. The big thing about this graph, and I think this shows it pretty well, is the things that we considered associated with critical thinking, all those green blobs that come up to the top, that is the biggest emphasis on teaching practices. So those things are, the first one, the facilitator helps students observe and look closely. The facilitator helps students interpret visual images, speculate, and draw conclusions. They're helping students describe what they see, to connect observations to previous knowledge. And the last one is help students recognize that there are many ways to interpret the world. So in terms of all the programs that we observe, those are the things that are coming out with the most emphasis in the teaching practices. I want to point out, all of this is available again in the summary and discussion and technical report, but I do want to just pinpoint a couple other things. This first purple one that comes to the top is the facilitator helps students question and investigate. You can see that's kind of rising up to the top in this list, and that's important because it relates to some of our student findings around questioning. And then I also just want to note, you can see where kind of how things shake out relative based on the color. Sensorial and affective is sort of supported across, human connections also across. As I mentioned, we were looking at observing both the museum and the classroom programs. Our idea was that they would be very similar to each other, was kind of the intent. There are a few differences that you might expect. The length of the museum programs ended up being a little bit longer than the classroom programs that we observed, just because normally with classrooms you're fit into a time slot, and so that they were just a little bit shorter on average. They also looked at, in the classroom, a little bit less works of art, and most importantly, I think, is that the student to facilitator ratio. Again, this is something you might expect. The museum programs normally had a student to facilitator ratio of 10 or 1 or less, because classes are separated into groups when they come to the museum, but for all of our classroom programs, the classrooms stuck together pretty much. So it's more like, it says 11 or 1 or greater here, but it was more like 25 to 1, or however many a class size is to the 1 educator, which was a big difference. In addition to that, something that came out that was interesting was just how teaching practices themselves differed from the museum or the classroom. So what this graph shows is the 5 different behaviors that ended up being different between our museum and classroom programs. So in the museum, these 5 things were happening more. So those are our blue things are the sensorial and affective response teaching practices. The purple is creative thinking, and then the orange are human connection. So what those are specifically, because I know this is hard to read, that first one is facilitator helps students experience a heightened perceptual, kinesthetic, or emotional response to objects in museum spaces. Facilitator helps students experience captivation, absorption, sustained attention. Facilitator helps students question and wonder, more happening in the museum versus the classroom. And then the last 2 help students connect with human experiences across culture, time, and place, as well as deepen and broaden their sense of self in the community. And then these are our 4 big key takeaways from the study. And these, I've kind of transitioned from talking about what we were seeing, what was happening in the programs, to what are the benefits that we're seeing for students as a result. So our 4 key takeaways or benefits of a single visit program are in these red boxes that you see here. So they are specifically questioning. Students ask more complex questions about works of art. Multiple interpretations, that students are more accepting of multiple interpretations of works of art. Emotive recall, so they have greater emotive recall of the program. And physicality of art, which is that they're more likely to talk about art in terms of their materials, properties. I'm going to go into depth on each of these, but I do just want to point out kind of this graphic representation. Emily mentioned one of our goals is to try and really nail down and talk concretely about the findings. So these things in the red boxes are very concrete measures that we looked at that I'll talk through. In terms of how they relate to the capacities, again, there's this interconnection and things not happening in isolation. So we've tried to use these lines, the thicker lines indicate where we see strong connections to the capacities, and these other thinner lines as other tangential connections to the capacities, to try and bring all of this together theoretically. So I'm going to start with questioning. So what specifically we found is that when we interviewed students about the Marc Chagall work of art that you saw briefly, students, when we asked them what questions or curiosities come to mind when you look at this work of art, students who had a museum program are more likely to ask more complex questions. And what that means, you can see our rubric here at the very top, number 4 is accomplished. So students are asking several questions and they wonder about the artwork or artist, and their questions are going into why. They're going deeper and they're connecting to interpretations or hypotheses that they formally said about the work of art in the conversation. Down to, no achievement is they don't have any questions or curiosities, which is pretty small. You can see just 7% and 12%. And then at the emerging level, I'll point that one out since there's a lot of students that fall into that. Those are basically just who, what, where, why, or just who, what, where questions, when questions. So they don't go into why or into anything deeper. So it may be like, I don't want to know what this thing is, or what that person's doing, and they don't connect back to something that they've said formally about what they think is happening in the work of art, and they stop at that point. So questioning is something that we consider as related to creative thinking, but as Stephanie mentioned, critical and creative are so often mentioned together, and it's somewhat hard to tease them out, and we do see in definitions of critical thinking how questioning lends itself to that as well. So our second big finding was on multiple interpretations. This was something that came out of questionnaire data. And what we found was that students who had a museum program are more likely to disagree with this statement, which is a positive thing. The statement being, all people should understand a work of art in the same way. So by disagreeing with that statement, they're kind of open to interpretation, open to seeing a work of art, open to the idea that different people can see a work of art in different ways. So again, this is a rating on a 4-point scale. So you may look at the numbers that are here, 1.65 and 1.9, and think that's not so much. But keep in context, it is just a 4-point scale. But we are seeing a positive benefit here. And again, multiple interpretations is something specifically when we wrote this statement, we were thinking about critical thinking, although it does have, again, ties to creative thinking because of that relationship. And also with this one, we were thinking it has ties to human connections as well, because you're thinking about other people and that other people can have different ideas. And this, I will also mention, specifically this finding has a relationship, I believe, with the Crystal Bridges finding around tolerance, the way they categorize tolerance in those statements. There's some parallels with this. Physicality of art. This finding comes from the student interviews. It was actually a warm-up question really for our students to kind of get a baseline and get them used to talking to us in the interviews. And it was, what do you think about when you think about art? And the responses, unlike the other ones where we had a rubric in mind already of what's a high scoring and what's low, this we just coded based on how they talked about art. And what we found was that the students who had a museum program were more likely to recall materials and talk about the material properties of the work of art than those who, both those who had a classroom program and those who did not have a program. And what this says to us is we definitely feel like it has a relationship to sensorial and affective responses. There's relations, again, to thinking about creators potentially and human connections in here. So there's a lot of kind of interesting things happening in this one. And then lastly is emotive recall, which also has connections with sensorial and affective responses. This finding, again, comes from the student interviews. At the end of the interviews, for those who had a museum or classroom program, we asked them to talk to us about their experience with that. So they were asked just in generally what they remembered about the program, and then we specifically asked them to talk about a work of art. And based on their responses to those two questions, we scored them on this rubric, which is about kind of their response. So at the top end, it's a more emotive, this 4 accomplished. Emotive, a lot of vivid recall of details. We're also using the audio to help us score this one, listening to the rapidness of response and tonation in the voice. And then down at the bottom is a response that lacks emotion, or they really don't have any memory of the museum or classroom program at the bottom. And you can see on this, these percents are how many of the students in these groups scored across. So you can see it's kind of spread across, but those who had a museum program, this treatment A on the left, recalling things much more vividly and emotively than those who had a program in their classroom. Okay. Kind of rapid fire going through those. I'm gonna stop at this point on this graph. How we've been trying to think about the findings is in terms of that first portion that I talked about is this portion on the left. It's kind of what is happening in these programs. This is kind of the typical conditions that we're seeing. And then the right side is what are the results. And you'll see this graphic in the summary and discussion as well as the technical report to help us think about what's the relationship between these two. We want to leave a lot of time for questions, which I'm going to do right now. So we have about 10 minutes. Is that right? Okay. We have 25 minutes? Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So we have 10 minutes, and I'm happy to go back to different slides if you want to look at them further in your questions. We're going to have some mic runners to help facilitate this part. So yeah, I see if you just raise your hand, a mic will come to you. I can see over on the left side, Michelle. And,
So my question for you is, the mic for recording, so we just want to make sure we capture. Thanks. Okay. My question goes back to the teaching behaviors. And you showed one slide that showed the teaching behaviors that are emphasizing there was a large number of ones related to critical thinking. That's all, yeah. And so just needed some clarification on, are those practices that you saw or practices that you were looking to see?
So what's represented here is these were these were strongly emphasized. These were practices that we saw in the programs. Did that answer your question, Ann? So.
And then when you go to the, I think it's the next slide. One more.
This one.
Yeah, that one. So these are the behaviors that you did see more of.
So yeah, good question. Okay, so these are all of the teaching behaviors that we observed and aggregated for museum and classroom. So in all the programs, these are the teaching behaviors that are, the ones at the top are being most emphasized, the ones at the bottom are least emphasized. From all of these that we were looking at, this is a subset of those that we're just seeing happening when you look at putting the museum and the classroom program side by side. These 5 are more happening in the museum than in the classroom, or are statistically more likely to be happening, and we're seeing them more in the museum than in the classroom programs. Okay.
Hi, I had a question about the number of works of art on the tour. So I know part of the selection process was that there were few works of art. That would have been the criteria for selecting the site. And then I noticed that on average, 7 were actually incorporated in the museum visit, and that seems like contrary to what we were hoping for in the experience.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so we found a little kind of halo effect in our survey data when we surveyed museums about how many stops they typically make on a tour. So they were normally visiting more works of art than that 4 to 5 that we were looking for. I actually think there was only one museum that consistently was under 5 for every program that we observed.
Question, I have a clarifying question and maybe a more specific question. Were the classroom facilitators, were those school teachers or were they museum educators?
They were museum educators, and so normally there's a slight difference. Normally with our museum programs, we're mostly done by docents. When we did the classroom, they were mostly done by museum educators, staff museum educators.
That's
but yeah,
interesting.
all of them were facilitated by staff. I will mention on that we asked museums to offer this museum program. Some had standalone museum programs. For some, this was kind of an artificial program that they created as purposes of the study. So I will just kind of add that caveat in there that these were not necessarily something that the museums that we studied normally do.
And I would add to that we also asked, because a lot of museums do classroom programs that include an art making component, and because we wanted the museum program and the classroom program to look very much alike, we asked them not to do any kind of art making component either at the museum or in the classroom. So that was something that we asked as well. And we asked that they don't do any pre-visits, because some museums go out to schools before they come on a field trip. We asked them not to do that as well, but we did say that if they wanted to send out any pre-materials, lesson plans or things like that that they would normally do, that would be fine.
And I want to add something too. This has been a big question. We've been presenting this in the last few months, and this question comes up. So Treatment B, the classroom programs, were specifically designated so that we could compare that experience with original works of art to ones that are outside the museum with reproductions. We were not looking at the effectiveness of classroom programs. And as Amanda said, some of them were artificially designed to help us to, take part in the study. I just wanted, I know people worry about that the classroom programs aren't showing an effect, but the purpose of them was very much to isolate that difference in original works of art and reproductions.
So I just, the follow-up question, sorry, did you in the more granular data find a difference between classrooms that had higher ELL or Title I students versus students that did not? Was there a difference or not?
So in terms of, we didn't look specifically for that variable. I mean, I put them into the model just to see if they, to kind of control for them really. So I do think there was one where there is ELL percentage, schools that had high ELL percents, they normally scored a little bit lower on all the measures, but because of how we did the analysis, I plugged them in for a control and can't really answer your question, Jack.
How soon after the museum visits did the student interviews take place?
It varied, so that's another variable that was in part of our regression. It varied everywhere from about a week to, I think I want to say 4, I can't even think how long, but it was like a week to like 4 weeks after. And we try not to go past that.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to the classroom versus the museum visit. I think the important point about that is don't give up on classroom visits. If you do them, we did a number of studies quite a while ago of classroom visits before museum visits. And we often found that the students got much more out of their museum visit after they'd had a classroom visit. They would go and see their picture, and they would have this, so they were worthwhile. I mean, you were trying to make that point. I just want to emphasize it. This doesn't, it's a little surprising that the classroom visits were not as effective as the museum visit. Or I should say, for me, it's unexpected. But it doesn't mean you should drop. If you go to classrooms, you should drop that.
I want to add that, remember, 2 of our findings relate to the sensorial and affective response, and we would expect to see a difference between classroom and museum when it comes to that particular capacity.
And just thank you, George, for pointing that out better.
Yeah, so just looking at the data up here, and it was sort of talked around earlier, I know we're looking at mean numbers here and then percentages, but I'm curious if the data breaks out, if there is a statistically significant difference between, say, groups that saw fewer works of art, right, so less than 7 on the museum visit, versus those that saw 9. And I'm going to ask sort of what I presume might be the elephant in the room. Is there a breakout between the docents and the paid staff?
Somebody had to talk about the elephant.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So Mike, your first question was about the number of works of art. Because really there weren't that many on the low end, they did all kind of congregate together, but they were all sort of, it's not diced out that way. I will say I put them on our program observations on. We have a nice healthy sample, but once it starts getting parsed out so much, I don't have a ton of program observations to work with necessarily in that way. Your second question was about the docents, and we did not. And again, for the same reason that there's not, when you actually take those 101 and look at the museum and classroom and parse them all out, it ended up getting a little small. I can say there are very few museum programs that were led by museum educator or staff. It was just all pretty much in that classroom program.
What kind of, the reproductions that you showed in the classrooms, how were you, was it digital? Was it like the size and scale? Can you explain a little bit about those?
So, and again, this kind of goes to where they were, we try not to put a lot of stipulations on the museum, so it was they could do easily. There were some museums that brought in printed reproductions that were, I wouldn't say life-size, or to scale, but they were larger. Some used digital, so it was a mix of both, so that also kind of, there's not a lot that we can really focus on the classroom program and tease out beyond that.
Just getting back to how you identified the capacities, it feels like a lot of it was looked at from the art museum educator's point of view. I'm wondering where in the study you got to the teacher's point of view and what they were looking for. Did that come out in some of the questionnaires or interviews?
I can answer.
Yeah, you.
Okay. Yeah, the teacher questionnaires, we have 90 of those. That data is reported. I will say I haven't pulled a lot from that data just because we didn't get all of the teacher questionnaires back, so it was kind of, we have the sample who returned the questionnaire. But what they said is that they put the most emphasis on having an awe-inspiring experience. That was the thing when we asked them to rate statements about their goals for museum programs. Having an awe-inspiring experience was one above practicing critical and creative thinking skills. But yeah, again, that data, it's not great because we didn't get all the teacher questionnaires back that we would have wanted, but from that limited pool, that's where they went.
And I think we have time for maybe one more question.
How did you arrive at grades 4 through 6?
So originally, I'm not sure if I remember where we were originally. I think there was a desire to focus on middle school originally, and that desire was because we had this notion that at that age they begin to do abstract thinking, that we'd be able to see more. But when we got the survey results back, we found that not enough museums serve middle school students to be the 7th and 8th to be able to do a study focused on them. The greatest audience served is K through 5. And so our compromise was 4 through 6. So we have, the lower end of middle school included.
And I will add with that, we did test a broader age range of 3 to 6, but we cut that in the pilot.
Oh, I forgot that.
Yeah.
Great. And now we're going to move on to have, let's get the slides forward. Barbara Bassett is going to come up and talk about our study user guide.
Okay, good morning, everybody. So, yes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the user guide. Jennifer mentioned it's still in draft form. It's one of the last things that we're working on, hopefully with a lot of input from you today on making it the best it can be to helping you use the results of the study. If you want to follow along, you do have a hard copy of the user guide, or at least some portions of the user guide in your folder. So to talk a little bit about this, the user guide's been developed really with two aims in mind. The first is to create a dynamic online document that serves as the access hub for all aspects of the study. So from the user guide, you're going to be able to get to the technical reports, to all of the study results, to the white paper, to the literature review. The second is that we wanted to create an essential guide for the study because that's a whole lot of information. And we wanted to give you a place where you could go and find out the facts of the studies and the implications really quickly and work with them from that point of view. So we hope in the end that this is going to be something that will provide you with the tools that you need to incorporate the study findings into your own work and to be able to share it with others. So I apologize, I was hoping that there was going to be a pointer, which there's not, so I'm just going to sort of gesture. As you can see from the user guide contents, it's a really long document, and I'm not going to go through it piece by piece because we'd be here for a really long time. But things to know, in the final web-based version, you're going to be able to choose to print the entire document. I hope you have a lot of paper if you choose to do that, or individual portions. You'll be able to navigate through the document by using the table of contents. So these will all be links where you can click and go directly to the part of the document that you want to. You'll also be able to click hyperlinks throughout the document that are going to lead you to outside publications and terms in the glossary. Okay. What I really want to talk with you about is the section that we're calling the user guide tools, because this is where we really tried to find a place where we could give you all the where, when, why, and how of the study really fast so that you could work with it. There's a research summary, which includes background on the development of the study, the research question, and a brief timeline of the study. So basically all the things that Emily was telling you about. It has an overview of the study protocol, so all of the things that Amanda was just talking with you about, and then a page with the key findings of the studies. Okay, then there's a series of study guide fast facts. And these are really thought of as two-page fact sheets that aim to give 5 potential user groups snapshots of the study, its backgrounds, findings, and implications, in order to give users the tools that they need to talk about the study, but to also have a kind of one sheet that you can give to people to read about the study and understand it. We happen to be getting ready for a family event, hence really fancy gold sparkly paper. But this is what it would look like, right? You'll be able to say, here, read about the study. It'll answer your questions and hopefully other people's questions. The 5 groups that are being addressed through the Fast Facts are school teachers and administrators, museum educators, museum leadership, policymakers and funders, and research professionals. And this is basically what the front and the back of those one sheets is going to look like. The first page is a quick reference guide. As I said, it has all the key background facts for the study. It's letting you know who the partners were, what the research question was, what the methodology was, what the student capacities were, and what the key findings were. The second page on your right-hand side is written with a particular audience in mind. So the one that's up there is Fast Facts for Museum Educators. It looks at the study findings through the lens of what those findings might mean for that audience. So you can see each one of the study findings, and then we've broken out some discussion around what those implications are. It makes several recommendations for how users might move forward with the study findings. And then finally, there's a short conclusion, and we were really hoping that that conclusion could kind of sum up the 2 pages, but also work kind of as like an elevator speech. So if you need 10 sentences or less to say about the study, there it is. All right. As we move forward, next in line are RKNA's study tools. So there's an observation guide, and we're going to be playing with that observation guide this afternoon in the breakout gallery sessions. And then the RKNA training protocol that they use to train the observers who went into the classrooms and talked with the students. Okay. Finally, there's a glossary of terms, things that we felt needed some explanation throughout the text, and those are the hyperlinks. So as you move through the text and go, what did they mean by critical thinking? You can click on it, and it's going to bring you to this glossary so that you can find out the definition that we were using. And then finally, there's this hub for all of the study publications. So you can click on any of those and get to the larger publication that we're referencing throughout the user guide. So just to sort of sum up, this is still in its draft form. We're looking forward to talking with you more this afternoon about what could make this a better guide for you to use as you're working with the findings and trying to speak with others about it. There's things that we want to add. There's going to be a PowerPoint presentation so that you can go to a meeting and have all of the slides that you've been seeing this morning. There will also be the recording of this symposium that will be part of the user guide. And all of this will be online sometime shortly after this gathering. So thank you. I really hope that this proves to be something that's really useful to you all.
Thank you, Barbara, and your team for working on that. It's very impressive how trying to make this as user-friendly as possible, because one of the most important things is to use this data. And so I think the user guide will be a really great tool for doing that. Okay, we are running pretty much on time, I think like 2 minutes early, so that's great. Everybody's doing a great job. Thank you for the presentations this morning. Before we take a break, Megan, there was one correction you wanted me to make in the afternoon? For one of the groups?
Yeah, groups D and E will be in the student
For the second session? Okay. For the second session this afternoon, groups D as in David and E as in Edward are in the student lunchroom instead of the Holly room. So we had a little more room in there. So if you're in group D or E for the second session, you will be in the student lunchroom. And just a logistics issue, most of the spaces we're going to be in are right in on this first floor in this area. So you should, if you have any trouble, just ask, as I said, someone from the DIA or one of those security officers. And the restrooms are basically right where you came in by the group entrance, right there. But right now, we're going to take a 20-minute break, and I'd ask you to be back here at 10:50 or a little bit before so we can get started on time with the directors. And Michelle has one more comment. Okay, thanks.
Before we dash off and chatter about this, there's a lot to think about. Many of you know if you're how many of you are members of National Art Education Association? Okay, so almost everyone in this room. Awesome, thank you. I just want to acknowledge that NAEA, the leadership of NAEA is all done by volunteers who do this in addition to their usually full-time roles as art museum educators. And I wanted to acknowledge previous director, Art Museum Division I'm going to start over. I'm trying. NAEA Museum Education Division Directors, and I want to acknowledge Leslie Wellman and Ann Manning, who both started, yes. And Jackie Terrassa, who basically wrote the IMLS grant and 2/3 of the literature review while she was working as well. So, the leadership of NAEA changes every 2 years, but we as a division within NAEA, I have to say, are one of the strongest in terms of continuity and making this project move forward and keep it going. And thank you, Emily, again for doing that after your leadership term ended. But I just wanted to acknowledge, because there's a lot of work that we've done in the past few years that we've been talking about, but a lot of that starts with an idea and talking to other colleagues and starting focus groups and lots of things to go into it. And this report is just really important for the field, so I just wanted to acknowledge their contributions. So thank you, and have fun with the break.
Okay, everyone, if, is this on? Is this on? Yeah. Everyone, we're gonna try to get started in a minute or so. If everyone can take their seats. And thank you all very, very much. The next portion of our symposium is entitled View from the Director's Office, a panel discussion on the study findings. And I'm happy to tell you that we want to have lots of time for questions at the end. But in your folders, in your blue folders, are some note cards. So during the course of the discussion, if you'd like to write down a question, and then we'll be collecting those towards the end, and we'll be directing those to our panelists to address. Okay, so did everybody know what I'm talking about there? Great, okay. So first, I want to thank all our panelists for coming, and thank you, Emily, for moderating. I'll tell you a little bit about each of them before we begin. So first of all, our moderator, Emily, who you've met, just a little background information on her. As you know, she's the Director of Learning and Interpretation at the Cincinnati Art Museum. With over 18 years of museum education experience, Ms. Holtrup has worked in the Division of Learning and Interpretation at the Cincinnati Art Museum since 2002. Her previous position with the museum was as the former assistant curator for school and teacher programs. Before coming to the Cincinnati Art Museum, Ms. Holtrup was the Education Outreach Coordinator for the Historical Museum of Southern Florida and the Caribbean, now History Miami. Ms. Holtrup served as the National Art Education Association Museum Education Division Director from 2015 to 2017, and was named the 2018 National Museum Educator of the Year by the same organization. Ms. Holtrup holds an AA in Art History from Grand Rapids Community College, a BA in Public History from Western Michigan University, and a Master's of Science in Architectural History from the University College London Bartlett School of Architecture. Thank you for moderating. We also have, well, I'll go from right to left. So Brian Kennedy is also here. He's the president, director, and CEO of the Toledo Museum of Art. Brian Kennedy has been the president, director, and CEO of the Toledo Museum of Art since 2010. He oversees a 36-acre campus housing one of America's great art collections and 3 architecturally significant buildings. He came to the museum with extensive experience in senior leadership positions at art museums in Ireland, Australia, and the United States. Born in Dublin, Ireland, Kennedy studied art history and history at University College in Dublin, earned bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees. A strategic thinker and collaborative leader, he has overseen the development of a strategic plan for the Toledo Museum of Art that strongly integrates it into the community. The plan has focused on sustainability, especially through alternative energy sources, building staff capacity, introducing new technologies, and developing an initiative to promote visual literacy. Diverse exhibition programming and significant art acquisitions have enhanced Toledo's reputation. And if you haven't been to the Toledo Museum of Art, I highly recommend it. It's just 1 hour down the road, so check it out. It's a beautiful, beautiful museum. Then we have with us, all the way from Utah, Gretchen Dietrich. Oh, I'm sorry, Salvador's next. Sorry, Salvador. Salvador joined... Salvador, my old boss. Former, right. Because actually, I think he is younger than me, so. Salvador Solort Pons joined the Detroit Institute of Art's curatorial division in 2008. He was appointed the Elizabeth and Alan Sheldon Curator of European Paintings and head of the European Art Department in 2011. 2 years later, he added the role of Executive Director of Collection Strategies and Information, overseeing one of the largest divisions in the museum, which included the departments of Registration, Collections Management, Conservation, Publications, and Information and Library Archives. Solort Pons has organized a number of exhibitions for the DIA, acquired important and beautiful Spanish works for its collections, and played a key role in the conception of the museum's strategic plan. Solort Pons was appointed Director, President, and CEO in October of 2015. He envisions the DIA as the town square of the community, a gathering place for everyone, where all are welcomed, represented, and united. Solort Pons is committed to making the DIA's extraordinary art collection relevant to broad and diverse audiences. Among the different initiatives in place, Solort Pons is working with the curatorial team to expand the collections of African American art, one of the best in the country, and recently acquired works by David Hammonds, Wadsworth Jarrell, Hank Willis Thomas, and Rashid Johnson. Prior to coming to Detroit, Solort Pons was senior curator at the Meadows Museum at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, assistant professor at the University of Madrid, and exhibit curator at the Memo Foundation Palazzo Ruspoli in Rome. So thank you, Salvador, for being here. And now we'll get to Gretchen. Sorry, you guys didn't sit in the order that I had. Gretchen, where are you? I just started with you. Okay, Gretchen Dietrich is Executive Director of the Utah Museum of Fine Arts at the University of Utah. Under her leadership, the UMFA has flourished with increased attendance, audience engagement, and community outreach, stronger partnerships on campus, in the community, and around the country, higher revenues, and new institutional support. Prior to her tenure at UMFA, she held positions in museum education, public programming, and exhibition planning at the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art in Hartford, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, and the we have a fan, yay! And the Philadelphia Museum of Art. From 2015 to 2018, Dietrich served on the board of the Association of Art Museum Directors and oversaw AAMD's Education and Community Issues Committee. So thank you, panelists. And Emily, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Can you all hear me?
Wonderful. And thank you all for joining us today and coming to Detroit. We had a great chat on Wednesday planning for this and a wonderful dinner last night. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And I think this is the closest I'm going to ever have to my Oprah moment. I'm sorry, I don't have any cards to hand out, so I apologize for that. And I do encourage you to write down questions because we are going to have a lot of time. I sent them some sample questions of things that I want to know and the core team would like to know, and they have those questions, but we also talked that this is going to be a pretty organic conversation. That's why we're sitting chat style as opposed to behind a big table so that we can really have a conversation. So I would encourage you to ask questions and get all of us thinking about bigger items. I mean, we just spent a long time talking about the study, and a lot of us in the room are museum educators, so we're looking at it very much through that lens. But it is really great to hear from our directors to see how this work is going to impact the larger museum environment and the visitors that we work with, and how they see this maybe aligning with each of our strategic plans and what happens after today. So I'm going to start with a fairly easy question, hopefully, and just so that we can set the playing field as to what is happening in each of their museums. So I'm going to ask if you could each briefly describe the field trip programs and resources at your institution so we understand what's happening at your respective museums. So Brian, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, well, we have, like everybody, I think, very, very extensive trips made to the museum. I think about 25, 30,000 a year. It varies. And these are basically docent-led. We have a large docent contingent, about 200 docents, 100 of them particularly active. Our largest population includes early childhood and middle school students. We have moved about 5 years ago from what was a sort of teach and tell kind of approach, the sort of traditional approach, to a much more engaged platform whereby the visual literacy methodologies that we've developed at the museum have been trained throughout our entire docent staff, our ambassadors, our guards, our staff, our board. It's very thorough. But that has changed the nature of the way that we interact these trips. We have bus funds. We have 100% paid bus funds, and we have a lot of money left over, but we're not giving you any. But because that's not really the issue. And we have a lot of challenges, but we can get to those as we have the discussion.
Thank you, Brian. And welcome everyone to the DIA. It's great to have you here, and we're very excited and honored that we are hosting this symposium for all of you. The material that was given to me and the results are very, very interesting, and certainly is going to help the museum work moving forward. Since the field trip program for the DI is one of our core aspects of our operations, as we work with the Tri-County area that really supports the DIA every year. Last fiscal year, we welcomed almost 74,000 students to the DIA, which is a historical record for the organization. Before we have the millage, we used to serve 39,000, so we almost doubled. We provide buses for the students and have them come here, and then when they are in the building, we have 11 guided options for teachers. So it's these tours in the museum are inquiry-based tours where there is a conversation with the teachers and the students, and questions and answers. We liked this, the concept or the focus of these tours based in how we connect our students with history and culture that is reflected in our collection. We also offer in our website at least 17 online resources for teachers, and some of these have been done with them in co-creation with them. As a matter of fact, we invite teachers to come to the museum at least once a year, so twice a year, and with them we help them shape programs or tours that will help the curriculum of their school so they can meet the goals of their organization. So we're very much focused on this. It's one of our greatest offers for our counties, and as I mentioned, we almost received 74,000 students last year.
That's a few more than we do at the UMFA.
Same in Cincinnati.
I just want, before I answer your question, I just want to say how thrilled I am to be here. Thank you for including me, and just to say thank you to the amazing people at AAMD and the amazing people at NAEA for funding this study. We've been talking about this for a long time, and I think, as Michelle just said, this was done by people with very full-time jobs along the way. So I'm grateful as a director and someone who cares a lot about this work. This is a wonderful thing. So congratulations, you guys. Well done. It's really great. So to answer your question quickly, we kind of are uniquely positioned as was mentioned, as a university art museum, and so we are very deeply connected with campus, about 40, almost 40,000 students, faculty on staff on the campus, but we're also the Civic Museum of Salt Lake, and we're also the State's Art Museum. They're sort of for hundreds of miles, we're kind of unique. And so we serve about 22,000 K through 6 kids a year, but only about half of that are actually coming to the museum in visits. For many years, we've done one multiple visit program with fourth graders in the Salt Lake district, which is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It really works, and that's a really important part of sort of the core, I think, of our K through 12 programming. And we're serving an increasingly diverse group. There's 120 languages spoken in the Salt Lake City School District, which some people are surprised by when I tell them that. So there's great diversity there. But half of that 22,000 kids, we are sending museum educators out into the hinterlands. And if you've ever been to Utah, it's big. So I'm going to point to Danielle because she used to say what great outreach programs that the Delaware Art Museum did. And milk came out of my nose when she told me that, because that's crazy. Utah's huge. And so we're sending museum educators, literally down into Arizona, back into Utah, to the Navajo Nation, and working with really tiny, very, very remote schools. We have a teaching collection, which I know is a challenging and somewhat complicated thing to have, but it does allow us to actually bring objects into classrooms. And when you live 5-hour drive from Salt Lake City, Utah, we felt that was important, and the children are given gloves, they're taught to handle these objects, they're allowed to handle these objects, but to really bring art, both contemporary art made by makers and artists in our own community, and also really a terrific way to engage the many different kinds of people living in our lands, who have lived on our lands. And so it's very much the core of the education department. I think that's true for many of us, and so much comes from the work that we're doing there. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to say thank you to, as you said, we all have day jobs and in museums, and I think those of us that have been working on this project are very thankful that we've had directors that have been supportive of us working on these projects, because it has taken time away from the work that we do on a daily basis for our own museum. So we appreciate having directors that are supportive of us doing this type of work. As I said, we really unpacked the findings this morning, and we sent those to you a couple weeks ago, and I would just really love to know if you were surprised at anything and in the findings, or had any kind of aha moments. And whoever would like to go first on that, if you had an aha moment or any surprises, and if so, what they were, and what they've made you think about as a result. Go ahead.
Start,
sure.
I'm in the middle.
I just asked the big question.
Well, actually, the thing that surprised me, and it was a very pleasant surprise because it's something that I was thinking about before we received this report, is the power of the materials in the works of art, and how this looking at the materiality or physicality of the objects sparks curiosity and, more importantly, creativity. So I think this is a really great point, and I'm thinking about how can we use our resources in the museum to really bring that more into relevance. And of course, the museum has a studio here, and we have teachers that show how to make works of art, and that's a good thing. But also, the museum has a conservation department where we really study the materials with which works of art are made. And we put a lot of resources behind our conservation department, and that's good because they have to preserve our works of art. But this work never gets into the galleries. Our visitors don't get to know what our conservators do. And in a way, if we don't bring into the galleries what we are learning about our collection from a conservation standpoint of view, we're sort of missing out on how we are using our resources. So how we can, with this piece of information that students come and are interested to know how works of art are made, could we, for example, and some of the museums have done it, establish in our galleries small conservation corners where our conservators will be working in a painting or a sculpture or in a drawing, and have the students come and have the conservator with the teachers explain how these are made and draw their attention into the qualities of a pigment or in the three-dimensionality of a sculpture or the color of the paper, and understand the process of making things.
Plus the intersection of art and science, right?
Absolutely.
So that's a really beautiful thing too. I mean, one of the things that I was slightly disappointed about is, from a very big perspective, I think we all do what we do because we know that art makes people's lives better, that art transforms people and transforms community. So I was a little disappointed that the study didn't show a little more directly those sorts of connections. And I don't feel like we need to apologize for that. I mean, I think we stay the course. We learned so much of the good that happens, but I was a little surprised that some of those other points weren't sort of higher up on the response list.
Can you give an example?
Well, not off the top of my head. Another question I have, which maybe I think we already kind of talked a little bit about, was we saw with the Crystal Bridges study that they really sort of felt that they could measure an increased sense of empathy in the students. And I think it's very interesting that in our study here that we're talking about today, we're not using the E word. And if you know Kaywin Feldman at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, that empathy is something many of us have been talking about for a long time. She's been doing really amazing work around that. So are we okay there that we're not using that, but we're talking about human connections? And I was disappointed that those things weren't hidden higher up, because I really feel like, and I've had so many experiences talking to students about works of art myself, where you could see them connecting to different ways of thinking and understanding and to other people through art.
Thank you.
I get that that's hard to measure. Very.
I had, from the particular point of the study, in a sense, we're trying to prove what we already know. So we did that very effectively. I think it was good, excellent in fact, to have a framing around the 4 different areas that could all be grouped under academic connections. I think it's fantastic to have elevator speech notes for everybody from directors to everybody else. All that's very, very good. But my surprise is actually something that comes out of the study. It's what else it points to. Many of us are very highly educated here. But look at the incredible amount of work that still has yet to be done. So the very fact that we can point to one study available about one museum, and then this study available at 6 museums, and things that come out of it. Just to give you a couple of examples that struck me. The issue of emotional recall and the issue of the difference between the museum group and the classroom group and the actual works of art and the reproductions is something that I think can really be mined for much greater work. I was reminded just earlier when the presentation was being made, I had the great fortune to spend a lot of time with Frank Stella, and he talked about the importance of space and time, and about what he called the space in between. And there's a difference between the space in between you and a slide and the space between you and an actual work of art and all that's around it. And so that connects to emotion. So that points to, for example, well, what do artists know about that we experience works of art? And what do curriculum developers know about that? And what do school administrators know about that? I mean, in a sense, my surprise is that we're, frankly, still talking to each other so much. And this is a real difficulty, which I share with all of you, of how to get traction with those in the school administration system, those who are developing the curriculum, those within university faculties. I mean, we have many college and university museums. But generally speaking, how do we take great public museums and impact our local universities? How do we develop models? And so that's been very much the focus we've had at Toledo, about looking in alternative directions. I mean, the excitement for me is, bear with it, the amount of work yet to be done and the opportunities that there are for people who want to enter into this field.
So anyone that's interested in taking this research to the next step, you can talk to us. I'd be happy to, I think we'd all be happy to pass it on to the next generation of folks that are working on this. So thank you. One of the things we are, we talked about this a little bit. I think a lot of us that are working on this project are too close to it at this point and can do the spiel pretty easily. But I would love to hear how the findings will help you talk about the value of field trips with your stakeholders. They're very, the results are very technical. And do you see a need to render the findings into a language that's more accessible for non-specialists, or do you have an elevator speech that you would use with a funder or with a board member as to share these results and how you would talk to someone who is not a museum educator or someone that is not in the field? So, whoever.
Well, I do.
Great. Going up.
Very
elevator.
passionately. The real issue for me is the sense of disengagement between the way we were educated and the visual age in which we live. And that impacts not just us, even the way we present information here, but the way that we interact with those who are training the trainers throughout. So for us, we need to impact the trainers, that is to say, those in the faculty of universities who train the faculty in universities. Those professors in universities are training the next level of education. And we're finding that our public school system's greatest frustration is that young teachers are being made without being trained about very particular things that they need to know within their system, which are not actually part of the educational training, but come out of every state capital every year. So whether it's active shooter training, or it's anti-bullying or sexual harassment or whatever, that these are very, very concentrated trainings that go into professional development, and they're eating up the money that trains our teachers that really should be used for training them in the types of things that we're talking about out of this study. There isn't a room for that. My effort with our donors is to really go to the threshold of the reality that our education system is in need of great, great reform, and that other countries are ahead of us in this, in recognizing the visual age that we're in, and the sensory education that's necessary. And we're going down the international rankings, and other countries are going up. And people resonate with that as they think about what is it that's causing that. People are passionate about education, and they want us to be self-aware. And all the different issues that come out here about creative thinking, about critical thinking, and about sensory environments and so on, they're absolutely what anybody recognizes. And many of our funders are grandparents, and we all regress back to our childhood beautifully. I'm starting to do that. And we begin to recognize that this is a different childhood to the one that we had, and there's a lot that we had that we hope that our kids will have today, and that how do we create that virtuous circle? The only way to get money is to have a very good idea that pulls a heartstring. And I think this study has some potential for that.
I think I would say that this study, provides lots of information and data to, as Brian said, to prove something we've all known all along, that these programs really matter. and make a difference. And I think what I would move quite quickly to the larger sort of why of a museum. Like, why, you know, your very first question, why do we do this? And it has to do with engaging community and engaging all of our community and being a community resource and mattering in the lives of the people who live, you know, in the regions where we serve. And so we've been thinking a lot about increasing the ways in which we align those values as an institution, and giving over a bit more of the authority of the museum itself to community. And how amazing is it to sort of say, we're going to learn from kids K4 through 6. You know, we're going to learn what the museum feels like through their eyes, and we're going to be an institution that is really working hard to actually meet their needs and to meet the needs of their teachers and educators and administrators, and begin at the beginning, and I think grow a community of people who love and value art and love and value the Utah Museum of Fine Arts. So for me, I would go from this is great to have, this is so important, and it proves that what we do really makes a difference, and you need to help us to do this work.
I, of course, would agree with Gretchen and Brian. And in my elevator ride, I would talk about the importance of seeing things in the flesh, you know. And I taught in university, and when I talked to my students and they did my test, I could tell immediately who of those students learned from looking at slides, or those who learn from going to a museum and seeing the works of art in the flesh, understanding their size, understanding their colors, understanding the composition, the depth. And that is something that you can only do in a museum when visiting it and seeing the works of art in the flesh. So that is a really important aspect of the study. I would also focus on the idea of creativity, how the results of this study tell us that just by one visit, students start to think and wonder and expand their creativity. When I talk about creativity, or when I think about creativity, I want to think about it as, or equalize it to problem solving. And when I go into the community here in Detroit, and I talk about this with our county's residents, I say, you know, when they come to the museum, the students, we don't need them to become Picasso or Michelangelo or anything, but what we would like is that these students, as they experience the collection and do the tour, become more creative, become problem solvers. And if you can get that skill in them, they are definitely prepared to be facing any challenges of life in a much better way. So by doing this, we are helping them be better citizens and better prepared for their lives in the future. It's just not a visit or a field trip where you see beautiful art. It's actually a visit that is helping them being better in the future professionals, if you want.
Thank you. And just kind of going off of something that Gretchen said and something we chatted about at dinner last night is one of the things we saw out of the study is 96% of the museums offer these types of programs, and that they provide young people with their first entry to art museums. And what more museums could do, perhaps outside of the museum education department, to welcome these students in so they do feel a sense of ownership in museums, and so that they want to come back. You know, you said tug on the heartstrings of the grandparents. Many people remember, oh, I went to X museum when I was in school, and I remember that experience. I think you were talking about cab drivers saying that they had come to the museum but hadn't been back since they were in 4th grade. So often when we have kids come in, how can we, and this is, the question is here, how can we make them feel more welcome and a better sense of ownership in the museum through how we collect or other things that we might do? Do you want to?
Yeah, We're pretty passionate about creating a sense of welcome. I think what's key is that, you know, in my institution, I don't put that on visitor services or education. That's everybody's business, you know, and from the very, you know, everybody who's a part of our museum, including people who work in the cafe, you know, we need to think about customer service. We were talking about customer service. You know, and I remember years ago, we did customer service training at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and everybody had to do it, and it was very controversial. But, you know, just this idea of welcome, and that you're greeted and you are made to feel welcome when you arrive. And really, we've thought a lot about our lobby space, wanting actual works of art in our lobby, but also having the furniture and the fixtures and that actual physical space feel welcoming, not like a bank lobby, which they often feel like. And for me, we chatted on the phone. I'm really, really passionate about making sure that when our students come, and when all of our visitors come, that they're seeing works of art by women, they're seeing works of art by people of color, they're seeing their own communities, their own ethnicities, their own sense of identity reflected in the works of art that are on view in our museum. And just a quick anecdote that I'll share. I gave a talk recently about women in art, and I went to college in 1985. And the textbook back then, do you all know, it was Jansen. And the very first edition of Jansen came out, I think it was 1982. So this is the book that I used to learn art history back in the day. Guess how many women are in the first edition of Jansen? 0. Right? So where are we? What did, little 17-year-old Gretchen, I guess I must have thought, well, I guess girls don't make art. But of course, if you look at who's in the MFA programs, more than 50% of students enrolled in Masters in Fine Arts, MFA programs, have been women. So when we bring people to the museum and we don't see ourselves, what is that message that's coming from the institution that women don't make art, people of color don't make art, Native people, Indigenous people don't make art, but they do. And so we're thinking a lot about really changing how we collect, who we collect, and how we make sure that there's diversity on view in the galleries. I think that's super important. Yeah.
Well, I fully agree with you, Gretchen. We have a great example now in the museum with Pat Joe, an artist from Ghana, who is making the coffin. And I was yesterday with a school from Macomb County, and the kids were just mesmerized by the fact that this man from Ghana had come here to the DIA and is making this coffin with his own hands, and they have 1,000 questions for him. And it was just fantastic, and they could see themselves that they could do it as well. And so yes, it's seeing things in the flesh here in the museum being done, or diversifying our collection, especially thinking about the communities that surround the museum and how we install the collection so it is relevant for them, and how the works of art, we need to be really studied in depth from a historical point of view. I mean, art history is very important and science is very important, but that is not the end goal of a museum. The collection is to be a platform from which we need to bring forward what are the themes, the things that are out there in the community that people are interested in, how they can connect with those themes through our collection and learn through the lens of our history and other things, important and relevant knowledge about that in the end bring the community together.
Well, I think we're all very, very actively engaged in essentially a transformation about the way that our museums have behaved. And it's going to take a lot longer than we've been at it. It's a generational effect. But the transformation that's occurring, I think, in museum direction and museum staff is going to be slow, depending on different types of professions within our profession. But it's going in the right direction. And I see that as a consequence of the bigger thing that's actually happening, which colleagues have referred to here, which is that we're all engaged in recognizing that our acquisition programs and our exhibition programs, or programs generally, have to respond very, very differently than they did before. We're not representing a history to our audiences that's a particular history. We're essentially beginning to also represent people to themselves. And that's transforming, I think, the types of works that are on show, which is creating that engagement. want to just pivot for a minute to really an interesting contrast I've been making with this study, which is a very different kind of study, and the general discussion that there's been over the last year that Arthur Cohen's La Placa Cohen study, Culture Track, for the first time put top of the category, a little bit like way we put Academic Connections as a sort of embracing group of a lot of other things. That the first and number one reason why people are saying they would go to museums is to have fun. And that's caused us all to really think about, really?
You're allowed to have fun at a museum.
But we have to have fun, but is fun really the number one category? Is that the embracing category? I mean, speaking to a room of largely art educators, and coming from a museum where, our purpose is only 2 words. We say the purpose of Toledo Museum of Art is art education. It always has been. So therefore, the contrast between fun and art education. Do people really go, is fun a consequence of learning? Is fun a consequence of awe and of being amazed? Is fun a consequence of the fact that 97% of our visitors go with somebody else, and you enjoy it with somebody else? So all the sort of consumption issues that relate to that kind of discussion, I then contrast with what you've given us in this study. And I think it's really interesting, the idea that our elevator speech from you, for the advice to leadership is, let's talk about the way that museums cause young people to ask more complex questions, for example, about works of art, or explore multiple interpretations, which dovetails then absolutely on the need for greater diversity and greater tolerance, and more than anything, global understanding. And we are in an era, let's be absolutely clear about it, that is akin to the 20s. So we came out of a great war, but we immediately emerged into a period which ultimately became excessive nationalism. And we are seeing across the world the proliferation of countries, the growth of the number of countries due to fracturing in various parts of the world. At the same time as we, as museums, speak for global understanding and for connections between people. So I think that what's come out of this study is something very serious and very, very important, that is essentially more important and certainly as important, for those who might argue, as having fun. So let's put those things together, mash them all together and have a good discussion with our colleagues when we get back home.
Okay, I agree. And you, that was going to be my next question is, as directors, what are you going to say to your education teams when you get home? Some of your education teams are here, right? Many of your education teams are here. And I would really love to know what kind of questions you're going to ask of them as a result of the findings of this study, and what you would encourage them to think about, and how this work may affect what you do back at your museums next week and in the coming months. I know that I am just starting to pull away from it and say, okay, what are we going to do at the Cincinnati Art Museum now with this, as opposed to NAEA? So I would love to hear from you as to initial thoughts of like what's going to happen on Monday, now that you're hopefully invigorated by this, and the kind of conversations and how conversations may change with your education folks once you get back to your organizations.
I'm excited to share the study. I haven't, because I was asked not to, with my team back home, and I'm going to ask them to spend time with it and then come back to me with their sort of read, what do they see? I really want to hear from them what they see and what resonates with them, and I'm hopeful that they, and I know my director of education, Jorge Rojas, I think quite a few of you know him, he's amazing. What I would love is some deep thinking around how this can inform and align with larger initiatives, larger strategic goals and ideas of what we're trying to do to really become a deeply community-centered organization. So I don't feel like I want to tell them how to make those connections. I want them to tell me how to make those connections. And the one thing that I might sort of push on a little bit is I am going to very much encourage them to have open minds and to not cling to the things that we've done the way we've done. So, really ask them to spend time with this research and to sort of think about how we might do better serving our students. And I do think we need to do some work around how we serve educators. I think that we've had increasing challenges getting folks to even come to our programming. We are on the campus of a university. I think we probably could have stronger connections to the College of Education at the University of Utah, which is a very large and really, amazing school. So that's what I'm thinking about right now. But I think that, coming from the other side, which maybe is a future question you're about to ask us, I think if we all as museum educators could bring to the leadership of our institutions and to our colleagues back home the ways in which what we've learned here can inform and help the museum do this work better across the board, serving everybody, making everybody feel welcome. That's what I'm sort of thinking about.
So I would share it with them, but more than telling them what I think, I like to know what they think about this and how we can improve our service to our students of the Tri-County area especially. I will have some questions for them, especially in the light of what this study shows about creative thinking versus critical thinking. And we do a lot of the DIA for critical thinking, and I'm a great believer on that area. But how can we think differently about this, and what can we do better in terms of critical thinking? Also interested in knowing what are we going to be doing with our multi-visit program, because we have a lot of resources devoted to that, on whether we should be focusing more in the one single visit to the DIA. So those are some of the practical things.
Well, as you said, some of our education team, Mike and Maria and Asma, are here. We didn't have too far to come. But we are in really serious discussions about auditing our educational programs at the moment. It's a question of how do you maximize the reach of an art museum? And I think we're all in this struggle that, if the previous one was, well, how many students can we get to come from the school systems to our museum in a year? And then this study shows that the educational impact in terms of curricular engagement is weak, but all sorts of other things apply. How could you, as educational institutions, which is the way I profoundly sort of structure what we do primarily, impact better? And I think that is really by turning the tables somewhat, not obviously stopping by any means what we do in terms of our school visits, but not seeking to get more and more, but seeking to move to instead engaging the training model to teachers in the schools, to activating within the university programs of trainee teachers. We have a memorandum of understanding now at the University of Toledo, and the aim is to grow, actually, ultimately to all students, a component of all of their classes, no matter what of their disciplines, so whether it's 1 hour, 2 hours, or a whole course, to teach students to read, understand, and write visual language. And we've found that our teacher training programs, among the many things that we've done, that has been the most successful, because where you get the teachers really, really engaged, as many as you have done, they then, for the rest of their lives, will bring their classes to your museum. But they also have an understanding of what they're doing when they get there, and they do the pre-work, and they understand the importance of the actual object. So I think this report has actually definitely cemented our view that we're going in the right direction from our point of view. And that's the direction I've just described.
Wonderful, thank you. And I want to open it up for questions from the audience. So if you have written down questions on note cards, hold them up and pass them to the end so that we can start collecting those, and because we want to definitely hear answers to what you have to say as well. One of the things we've been talking about, and Gretchen, this is a question I want to put to you, and then contributions from Salvatore and Brian. While your museum was closed for renovation, your team began doing programs out in the community that you've continued after reopening. Do you foresee the study's findings having implications for other youth-focused programs outside of a school tour? And what do you foresee those being? And like I said, that's also a question for the other panelists, if you see that as well.
I mean, the easy answer is yes, of course. And the reason that's an easy answer is because this particular program that we created while we were closed, which we call ACME, you can learn about it on our website. It stands for Art, Community, Museum, and Education, is all about sort of turning everything we thought we knew about museum practice sort of upside down. So, so we're doing programming in the community in partnership with the Salt Lake Public Library. So we're not actually even bringing people to the UMFA, but really meeting community across the city and the region to have different kinds of conversations. And we're not leading these conversations. We're connecting to artists and activists and educators and community leaders within our community and saying, what does the community want to talk about? And I have to say, you know, I have said, and they're okay with me saying that we do this often through the lens of art and creativity, but not always. You know, we've had conversations that we just sort of feel need to happen and see ourselves as an organization that can bring people together, different kinds of people together, which is, you know, in response to what Brian said, I think we kind of need to do more than, you know, more than ever. So we've had conversations about women and migration, about feminism and art, about Native contemporary art makers and creators in our community, about our LGBT and our trans community. So so that's been sometimes hard for me because I feel like we're using museum resources, we're doing this community-based programming, and someone will come up to me and say, I love your museum, those dinosaurs are wonderful. And I'll say, I don't work at the Natural History Museum, I work at the Art Museum. So I sort of wonder, are we, you know, people don't even necessarily know that this is a program that's been created by the UMFA, but my staff is so deeply committed to this sort of giving away the authority and sort of saying to our community, help us to have these, help us to be an organization that can make these conversations happen, and it's all done with the hope that we will learn from community about how to be a better art museum. And so for me, really recognizing that we might do exhibitions or even show work that like 5 years ago I don't think I would have been okay with, but really sort of thinking differently and opening the doors in new ways. So I still don't really know the answer to your question, Emily, about how this study can connect to the work that we're doing around this community engagement stuff, but absolutely, I know my education staff will have ideas about that.
Wonderful, thank you. And I was listening, I was also reading.
You're busy.
You all have lots of questions, and I will try to get through a good portion of them before everybody's stomachs start growling for lunch. And the first one here is, how will these results inform the way you do labels in gallery interpretation and types of exhibitions, works on view? If these emotive responses are important, questioning is a strategy to increase, i.e. putting questions on labels or arranging galleries around questions. Sorry, it got very small writing. So do you foresee that change?
We're wicked into questions. So we were closed for a year and a half. We reopened. We translated 3 of our collections fully into Spanish, so it's there. And my team convinced me to do bullet points. Have you guys seen this? So that was hard for me, but I did it, and it's awesome. I said yes. And so really the curators working in teams with educators created all of our, so that's a very important part of it for us at the UMFA. Curators don't write labels alone, and I spent so many hours editing my colleagues' label copies to have them not accept a single suggestion. That we don't do it that way at the UMFA. They need to work together. And questions, I definitely sort of feel that I'm pushing, I feel like my educators would love more questions, and I'm sort of pushing them to sort of not go crazy with questions. But in our Modern and Contemporary Gallery, when we reopened, every work of art on view is made by a woman or a person who identifies as a woman. And instead of writing a big, text panel about art and feminism, we just did questions, and they're beautiful. And the last question is, who can be a woman? And I just thought that was amazing. And so it's there in English and it's there in Spanish for people just to go off and look at art with questions in their mind. So I'm glad to get a little good feedback on the bullet point thing. But yeah, labels have been big for us.
Other thoughts?
At the DIA, we write labels, curators and interpreters work together, and for example, for the reinstallation of our Asian galleries, it was just not labels and curators working together, but we engage our community through focus groups and in-community consultants that were part of our teams. So I think the product that end up being in the gallery is really a product of co-creation with the community. So this obviously this report is going to inform some of the things that we're going to do moving forward as we think about the students coming to the museum.
Thoughts?
Well, I mean, your question specifically is about this report. So this is 4th to 6th graders.
Mm-hmm.
So frankly, I haven't thought about that yet.
Okay, great. We have a lot of folks that are very interested in looking at staff and specifically, let me see, where is it? I just had the question and it just left me. Okay, is it reasonable and sustainable to ask volunteer docents to do this vigorous and important work? So many of us rely on docents, volunteer docents to do this work, and the work is getting even more vigorous and even more in depth, and we're asking a lot of those folks. And thoughts between docents and paid museum staff to do these types of programs, and would love to hear your thoughts on that as well. There's a lot of questions here that address that issue.
Well, at the DIA, we changed from docents to the professional teachers when the millage was passed in 2012, because we had a service agreement with the counties, and the service agreement has 4 parts. One is free general admission for all the residents of Auckland, Wayne, and Macomb. The second part is our field trips program, which is so successful. The third part is our senior program. The fourth part is a community partnership program that we have that has been working really, really nicely. So for the field trips, because we were going to be doing so much, we had really a business commitment, an agreement with the 3 counties about how many people and how much money we had to invest within it. We switched, and this was done during the former director Graham Beale, to professional teachers.
Well, first of all, I mean, I think we all acknowledge that docents do incredible work and have done for such a long time in art museums. The nature of what this study says, I think, is probably responded to by most of us who weren't part of the 6 museums involved. We recognize this and say that would be so, but the docents themselves, of course, would be a very important cohort to be part of a review in terms of their experience, and I suppose maybe that's a bit of a gap here in that there were...
We actually did interviews with the museum facilitators as part of the study to get their feedback on how they thought the programs went. So we did have some conversations with the folks leading the programs.
Right, but we've all got a lot of them in our own museums, a lot of docents, and so the extent of surveying the way to go. There's definitely a move to recognize that actually the way it was in many museums decades ago, where you had a larger education staff of paid teachers, is a way to go. And that's going to be a significant dialogue, I think, within the Docent Association nationally, to recognize that it's not a challenge to docents in America, but rather a development of the recognition of what the research is saying. And I think, therefore, that the NAEA and the Docents Association, I mean, there's a potential considerable dialogue to be had between, which could be very, very helpful to directors, because there's nothing so challenging as an unhappy docent organization.
Amen to that.
Yeah, I'll second that. You know, I've sort of been wondering about this for a long time. I think obviously many of us have, and I've just sort of felt, I mean, first of all, for my museum to figure out a way to pay museum teachers for us would be a very, very big challenge. So I'll just put that out there. Financially, the numbers are hard. But I do increasingly really wonder if it's fair. You know, we are asking these amazing people who love the museum, who care about art, who really want to be there for all the right reasons. Not only do they need to know about art, not only do they need to know about what's, you know, how to teach, teaching technique, VTS or whatever we're doing. And now I think as sort of communities change, the sort of gap between wealthy people and poor people increases. We're bridging such difference, and they're meeting these students, as you all know, 1 second before they go into the classroom. And so, to me, that's a lot to ask a volunteer to do well, and to be really frank. In my museum and museums I've been a part of, we have people who are exceptional at this, exceptional educators who really get it, who are prepared, who do an amazing job, and then we have people who don't. So there's such a disparity in the quality of the experience that I think that aggrieves all of us a lot, and you know how much, you know, it is really hard work. And I think even with the very best docent training programs, there's just going to be a difference across the group of educators in the docent corps. So you're going to get that difference in quality of experience, to be frank, which I think we see and we struggle with. So it's a really challenging question. And I mean, the Getty a couple of years ago switched, right? They had paid educators, and now they've moved to a docent model. And I remember thinking, wow, really? And never talked to some folks about that, never really got good answers there. But if I had the budget, maybe it would be a different conversation within my museum. I think for the time being, we're working hard to diversify our group, to bring younger people, people from other parts of our community into that group to feel really connected and a part of that program, but it's a challenge.
I just would like to say something about what you're saying, because as a European, was born and raised in Spain, in my country, and I don't know in other countries in continental Europe, but we don't have docents in museums that work for free as volunteers. And when I came to America, I was... What? Yes, but when I came to America, I was just amazed by the fact that this...
We didn't even know what a docent was.
Many people still don't know.
I mean, and it's extraordinary the work that these volunteers do, and is the highest form of philanthropy that there is. And this is so rooted in the American culture. Is one of the greatest value of America, to give back to the community and do these things that, in a way, the volunteer program, docent programs should be continued in America, because it's a great example for the community as itself. It's as itself. Yeah. So I just wanted to point that.
It's true. Coming from a museum whose docent corps started in 1960, yeah, they're embedded, and they're so vital. We have just a few more minutes, and this is kind of a question, and I hope everybody's taking notes, because I would really love to hear, and this is a great question. As leaders of institutions trusted with ensuring the lasting relevance of your institutions, what topics would be at the top of your wish list for additional research around school programs or in museum education? You know, museum educators are doing a lot of research now. In research into the how, and not maybe how of what we do, and as opposed to art history content, but what would you like to see be the next big project or be the next thing? And maybe this is also comes out, what bigger questions do you all have that you would like to pose to this group that you would like us to dig our teeth into? Go ahead.
So the biggest and most interesting thing for me, and I feel very privileged to have engaged with a lot of people over the last number of years that's really taught me this lesson, is that the advance in understanding of the development of the human brain, which is still tiny in comparison to what it will be, has taught us that when people are educated in one way, or infused with information in one way, they take it in more than if they're infused with it in another way. And there are multiple examples of this across the planet at this stage. There is a whole field of pure research in neuroscience, in cognitive psychology, all these disciplines, which is providing information about what works to educate the human brain and what does not work so well. and we do not have an adequate link. And so our plea is to bring that together. A wonderful man, Stan Dehen, that I've come to know in the last number of years, a brilliant, brilliant brain scientist, won the Brain Prize in Europe. He's written books about how we learn to read, how we learn to count. He's written a new book called Apprendre, which when you read it next year in English, learning. And Macron has put him as the top of the Council of Education in France. He and his wife, in particular, studied the impact of putting information into brains that are 0 to 5, but not only. And he's become aware that the pedagogical impact of what they're doing impels and compels them to start to enter into the political fray, into the fray of policy. So there's a whole field that is providing information, I think, with which we are relatively disconnected. And I'd love to see that as the major focus of current research.
So I'm very specific on what I would like to know more about. And
we like specifics.
It's true. And this is a little bit what I was telling before about creativity and the connection to problem solving. And what is the relationship between both of them, and what can we give the students when they come to the museum? What is the impact that they have in their lives by being exposed to works of art through an inquiry-based tour? And if we could convince some organizations that funding a new wing for a museum is actually a good thing because it's going to help the students be better prepared for their lives, it's actually helping their brains being better prepared for their future challenges. If we could have more information about that creativity plays a role there, I think that would be fantastic. I would like to see Bill Gates funding a new wing at the DIA because it's good for the human brain, as good as it is, finding a vaccine for the malaria or anything like that.
Are you sure you want to ask this question? Because aren't you kind of pooped after doing this amazing?
I'm not saying that I'm going to do the research. No, I mean, I am a little pooped, as you say, but I think that there's probably lots of people in the audience that aren't, so that would love to take research like this on.
Well, I would love to hear from this community of people about where this study could go, right? What are the questions that still exist around this work? I would love to know more about museums and pre-service educators. I think that is, as Brian said, just like that's always just been a dream, right? That every person who becomes an educator in America should learn to teach with art and objects and learn to navigate museums with their students. I mean, that just seems like such a no-brainer to me. And yet that just doesn't seem to happen, does it? It's very challenging. I also think there's a lot of energy and a lot of conversation around internship programs. And I think that's wonderful and so important. And I've been thinking more and more about high school, younger students, right? Because a lot of in university art museums, college art museums, we're seeing internship programs being funded, hopefully bringing students of diverse background into the museum, encouraging folks to think about careers in museums. But I fear that getting them when they've already started their college years is too late. So I sort of wonder, I just sort of love the idea of having high school students more in our museum. That's not something that we do, and I know that's something that some of you do. And then I also wonder about early childhood. I mean, you mentioned 0 to 5, what about the littles? And often I think that there's concern and nervousness. We all sort of see a wild, crazed 2-year-old, running free with the mother with the stroller behind, and think, oh no. But how could art museums, what does that look like? And I think there are many of you who run programs for really small children. We don't at my institution. So that's just an idea.
Wonderful. And I think that with that, I want to thank the three of you for joining us today and coming to the DIA. Hopefully we all have lots of things noodling around in our heads. I know I do. And that we're excited about spending the afternoon kind of unpacking this further. And unfortunately, we won't be able to answer all the questions, but please, come up to any of us that were on the core team if you have questions about the study or anything over lunch or for the rest of the afternoon or at the reception tonight. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Emily. That was really great and stimulating conversation. It's time for lunch now, time for some nutrition. We have lunch boxes for you up in the Crystal Gallery, and the best way to get there is to go back out to Prentice Court, which is where you might have hung your coat, right by the entrance where you came in. Just past that is one of those giant elevators, and you can go in there up to the second floor and go to your, right when you come in, and there'll be the wood doors to go right into Crystal Gallery. And that's where you can pick up your lunch. You can eat in Crystal Gallery, or you can come back downstairs and eat in the Prentice Court area. Okay, so we have 45 minutes for lunch. After lunch, we're asking everybody to gather back in Prentice Court, where your coats are, and then we'll divide up into groups, okay? Thanks, everybody.